Welcome to the first major meeting of atheists on atheism, Islam, and religious criticism. We, the Norwegian atheists, would not have had the muscle to do this so early unless the Human-Etisk Association had expressed an interest in participating in the event. It doesn't hurt to have Big Brother in the back. A special welcome to Shabana Rehman, our good friend and international comedian and speaker, who will be chairperson for us today. The picture is from our demonstration for Charlie Hebdo, January 2015, in front of our parliament. She has some trouble with her arm. Not full control. We want to market atheism as something positive, something more than just saying no to gods and devils, heaven and hell. With a little pun, we stand for the unbelievable atheism. We are born free and know only one life after birth and before death. We are the result of the laws of nature in a painstaking, blind and necessary development over 3 billion years on this planet. We wake up to see our own responsibility for the planet that has nurtured us. We want people to shine with pride in their atheism and awaken the majority of atheists who still stand as members of the Norwegian Church, and where it's rumored that a large majority of the priests lost faith before finishing their 7 years education for state-paid wizards. We atheists in Norway have fought and toiled with church and Christianity for 50 years and feel that we have almost won over old ages and abuse. Hell is mostly extinguished. We pagans were used to joking with religion, with Judaism and Christianity. We read from the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, and on the open street with a microphone in hand and invited passers-by to say what they meant. Islam was not on the agenda at that time. But with immigration, we have begun to become acquainted with another religion from the Middle East that has fallen short in its liberation. Islam is not open to debate. Islam is not to be tampered with. In Sharia, there is the death penalty for blasphemy, for denial of God, for apostasy. 12 years ago, we got an idea. We wanted to create a great seminar on humor in religion and challenge believers to laugh by themselves and each other. We invited representatives of Judaism and Christianity, and they were thrilled. This they wanted to be part of. We contacted experts on Islam to find out who we could get along with. But at that time, it was absolutely impossible to find any Muslim experts who would participate. Yes, even experts at all. The Cooperation Council for Beliefs and Perspectives and the Holocaust Center were interested, but for several reasons it went down the drain. Perhaps one of the reasons was Ayatollah Khomeini's TV speech in 1979. We quote, "Allah did not make man so that he could have fun. The aim of creation was for mankind to be put to the test through hardship and prayer. An Islamic regime must be serious in every field. There are no jokes in Islam. There is no humor in Islam. There is no fun in Islam." We Gentiles were raised in the Nordic countries, where a Danish poet wrote these words of truth. Den, der kun tager spøg for spøg, og alvor kun alvorligt, ham og hun har faktisk fattet begge dele dårligt. The one who only takes joke for a joke, and seriousness only seriously, he and she have actually gotten both bad. How should we meet such a religion, we who want life to offer compassion, love, and laughter? We who believe that the truth about the world and ourselves must emerge, even if this truth contradicts an immigrant religion. We advertised for this meeting on Facebook and positively encountered many reactions from curious and sometimes angry Muslims. The reactions showed a lack of understanding of what atheism is. Many believe that atheism is a religion that we should keep to ourselves. One example from Facebook: all this is just nonsense. It is a pity that they are misrepresenting the religion of Islam. Islam is not oppressive, not extremist. Islam is peace. No Pakistanis agree with Shabana. Zaid Ali is a Norwegian comedian who was originally invited to post at this meeting. He says in an article in Morgenbladet in 2017 that developments are going in the wrong direction, that third-generation immigrants are more conservative than first generation. In addition, they are religiously educated and not illiterate. They are more fanatical and looking for trouble, so he does not think he will experience a liberation of Muslim humor in his lifetime. The young moral police are better organized through social media. More people follow, and hate messages come from a group more than from individuals. He is afraid of the increasing religious control in Norway and in the world. Zaid Ali is a pessimist. He believes that it has become more stringent and difficult in recent years, and does not think he will experience that it will be okay to joke about Islam. Here are some questions we atheists pose for further work on Islam and religious criticism, to which we may have some answers today. What should we demand from society to promote integration and inhibit Islamization? Can and should Norway stop public support for religious communities? Should Norway require access to Quran schools and all-day institutions? How should we as atheists promote dialogue and integration? How can we best talk and debate with new compatriots about faith, about Muhammad and the Quran, about honor killing and forced marriage, even with children, with smile or seriousness, with contempt or empathy, so that we move forward in a society that allows us to live well with each other, where we can respect each other. We found 3 distinguished women who have worked extensively on this issue. Maryam Namazie from England, Sarah Haider from North America, and our own Shabana Rehman. Thank you.
Dear all, in 22 countries, apostasy, leaving religion, is illegal. In 12 of them, it is punishable by death. Despite the fact that a growing share of the world's population are non-believers, religion is still putting strong limitation on basic human rights in many countries. This affects atheists, non-believers, and humanists particularly hard. Humanist International's Freedom of Thought report, whose 2019 edition was launched this Wednesday, documents the very real need to work to promote the rights of humanists, atheists, and non-believers worldwide. there are some good news. Though Norway abolished our blasphemy law in 2015. And in the last few years, blasphemy laws have been repealed in both Iceland, France, Canada, New Zealand, Greece, and Denmark. But in 74 countries, blasphemy is still illegal. And sadly, there is reason to fear that the Greek laws is about to be reinstated. In 43 of those countries, blasphemy is punishable by jail. In 6, by death. The Norwegian Human-Etisk Association strongly supports the End Blasphemy Laws campaign run by the Humanist International. The right to criticize religion is a crucial part of freedom of both speech and belief. That includes the right to ridicule and blaspheme. But criticism of religion is not just a right. Sometimes it is also a duty. When religious practice unduly limits people's freedom, violate their human rights, or are used to legitimize abuse, criticism of religion is more than legitimate. It's a duty. As it is when the secular society comes under attack from religious groups who attempts to undermine democracy, the rule of law, or human rights by subjugating politics to religious limitations and rules. The Norwegian Humanist Association, with its 95,000 members, the world's largest humanist organization. We have a long tradition of criticism of Norway's majority religion throughout our 62-year-long history. A tradition of free thought and rationality which goes back centuries. Hopefully, this conference also marks the beginning of a closer cooperation between the Norwegian Humanist Association and the Norwegian atheists, the former Hedalen Samfunnet. Their clear, critical, and at times playful criticism of religion have played an important part in the history of Norwegian criticism of religion since the middle of the 1970s, and whose history will be told in Even Gran's book to be released next year at Human-Etisk Forbund. The Norwegian Humanist Association have at times struggled with the question to how to criticize negative aspects of minority religion without impacting the minority as such. When it comes to criticism of Islam, we have a lot to learn from ex-Muslims and secular Muslims, who ought to be free to criticize the religion without these kinds of doubts and limitations. It is therefore both a privilege and a pleasure to be able to learn from two of the foremost ex-Muslims voices internationally, Sarah Haider and Maryam Namazie, who have defied accusations of intolerance and Islamophobia and fought for the rights to speak their mind about the negative aspects of Islam. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to be Master of Ceremony tonight. And since my hand is up there, I think it needed an explanation. Yes. So I will start. Thank you, Dagfinn, for letting my hand hang there. It all started when I publicly first time announced that I'm a non-believer. Say hello to my fundamentalist animalistic hand. It's a part of me, like our culture, our religious background. So every time we say something which is non-acceptable, like I love Jews, it slapped me on my face. The reason for that, we still can't get rid of it. Maybe we have to cut it off. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe we can teach this hand to behave. Well, the reason for that is you don't have freedom of speech in Muslim countries. You know, you get killed if you speak your mind. It's so common to kill people in Muslim countries that even Americans are killing people there. The first speaker tonight is a lady which I have a pleasure to work with. And she's also the reason that artists like me and activists and protesters all around the world never felt alone. I know many Norwegians here tonight who know my story, know that for several years Norwegians keep asking me, you must be really alone. Are there any more secular voices like you? But I never felt alone because I knew there are people around the world who are fighting the same fight like me. And the lady coming up on stage now is one of them, the most important one. So thank you, Maryam, for never letting me feeling alone. You will tell your story yourself, so please ta godt og varmt imot Maryam Namazie.
Thank you. I just want to keep time so I don't talk over, sorry. And I'm really bad with this stuff. Okay, stop. Okay, great. Hello, thank you to the atheist group, to the humanist group, to Dagfinn, to Lars, to Arnfinn for inviting us here today for this very important discussion. It's a real pleasure to be here. I wanted to speak about blasphemy, not bigotry. And I suppose for me, I think that blasphemy is really an important act of resistance and challenging the status quo. And I think that throughout history, we know that the act of blasphemy has been very important in advancing human society and human welfare and human rights. If we look in the area of science, for example, that's one example where, advances in science were seen as a direct challenge to the church and an act of blasphemy. And the same goes for women's rights issues. If you recall, quite recently in Ireland, they had a vote to make abortion legal in that country for women who choose to have abortions. And very clearly, the Catholic Church was against this repealing of the Eighth Amendment. And when it won, it was a victory for women and men in Ireland to have the right to abortion. It clearly was seen as a diminishing of the church's role in Ireland. If you look at the suffragist movement, the movement for the right to vote for women, again, very clearly in confrontation with the church. One of the US suffragists, Stanton, said very clearly that the Bible and the church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. Gay rights is another area where we see this challenge against the church and religion. These are the sisters of perpetual indulgence. And it's poking fun at Christianity's role, at its homophobia, and opening up the space for dissent. Now, if we have that same criticism against Islam, it does get a little difficult for us to do that. So to give you an example, in this year's Pride, we were the imams of perpetual indulgence. And as you know, in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia, they have committees that promote virtue and prevent vice. Well, we were the committee to promote vice and prevent virtue. And again, in Gay Pride, we know very clearly that there is a large criticism, very extensive, historical, widespread criticism against Christianity and religious dogma. You have Allah is gay. If you have Allah is gay placards, it's frowned upon. But if you say Jesus is queer or Jesus has two dads, it's okay. And so what I want to say is that we see our criticism within this long tradition of resisting religious dogma and fighting for human rights vis-a-vis not just the church, but the mosque, Islam and Islamic states and Islamism. And of course, if we do say something, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, and say the Quran, Islam and Islamism are the greatest stumbling blocks for women's emancipation, again, not so comfortable to do. If we criticize the Quran, as she criticized the Bible, she wrote the Women's Bible about how there's misogyny within the Bible and how it needs to be resisted. Or if you criticize Islamic states, not as easy to do than if you criticize the Christian right. And of course, this is something we faced quite regularly in our fight for the right to blasphemy and apostasy. At our first ever Pride March in 2017, the police tried to stop us from carrying Allah is gay placards. They said that it offended some people. And we did explain that, well, religious rules offends us. And gay people offend some religious believers. Does that mean gay people shouldn't be allowed to march here? Because it does cause a lot of offense for some people. And they did try to remove our placards, but we refused to let go. And basically, we were allowed to march, and we carried on marching. One of the things that happened after our first marching at Gay Pride in London was that there was an official complaint filed against the Council of Eks-Muslims of Britain, which I'm one of the spokespersons of and founder of. And it's interesting because all the media talked about Muslim leaders, but they weren't Muslim leaders, they were Islamists, from the East London Mosque, from MEND. These are organizations that promote the death penalty for apostasy, that promote stoning to death for women who have had sex outside of marriage, that promote the murder of LGBT. So they had filed a complaint, and interestingly, it took 8 months for Pride in London to decide whether they would allow us back or not. And 8 months is a very long time for such a simple decision. If there had been some Christian right group that had filed an official complaint with Pride about a Jesus is gay banner, would it have taken Pride 8 months to make a decision on which side it stood on? And I think those are some of the issues that we often face as ex-Muslims. There was a journalist, C.G. Whirlman, who said that ex-Muslims not only adopt the same tactics as Nazis, but they're also supported by Nazis and white supremacists. And again, I didn't see any Nazis at the Gay Pride. I don't know if you've seen Nazis there, because they're really pro-gay rights, Nazis are. So again, this idea that any criticism of Islam is immediately equated with far-right bigotry. I mean, in fact, a lot of our other placards said refugees welcome, fuck Islamic homophobia, and also bigotry. It was against the far right. And many of those marching were refugees, migrants, and people who were, the majority were minorities in Britain. And there was an incident at Goldsmiths University in 2015 where I had a talk there about this issue. I was invited by the Atheist Humanist Society there. And the Islamic Society brothers, they tried to cancel my talk, and when they weren't able to, they then came and tried to disrupt the talk. They intimidated the audience, they tried to intimidate me. They even made some death threats against some of our activists. And the whole thing was videotaped, not because I had asked for it to be videotaped, but because the student union wanted to see what sort of horrible things I'm going to say, so they would have evidence against me. And actually, it helped me because it became very clear that they were the ones who had disrupted the event. And any sort of comment I got on this was from the Feminist Society and the LGBTQ+ societies siding with the Islamic Society and not with me. And it's interesting because the head of the Islamic Society, the one who led the disruption, he actually had to resign a few weeks later because some homophobic tweets of his had come out. And still, the LGBTQ+ societies and the feminist societies didn't think that they needed to make any statements around that. And I was also barred from speaking at Warwick University, again, because I'm inflammatory and I'm going to incite hatred, which is what they say. I mean, the fact that blasphemy has now been equated with this is a very clear way on how this silencing is taking place of blasphemers and apostates from Muslim backgrounds. And there was a Comment is Free article by the editor of Comment is Free of The Guardians, saying that there's nothing misguided about the left's concern for Muslims. Well, I'm very much on the left. And this idea, that how patronizing to think that by silencing our dissenters, you're actually, defending the left. Defending Muslims. You're so concerned about them. In a sense, it's not only patronizing, it has a really poor view of Muslims, because you think that the minute someone is a Muslim, they're incapable of hearing an argument. They're either going to faint from offense or they're going to cut someone's head off. And that is such a racist view of Muslims, I would say, because we all have families who are Muslims. My father is a devout Muslim, but he has always supported me. And how dare you say that Muslims need protection and they are incapable of hearing dissent, listening to it, and challenging it and having a conversation like anybody else would in this room and elsewhere. And I think part of the problem is, of course, this identity politics that we're stuck in. I think it's doing a great disservice to solidarity movements, to movements for equality, because now it's just become about one identity out of all the many identities and characteristics that we all have. And it's also, it's those in power that decide what the authentic identity is. And so you have very clearly a situation where if you're Muslim, you're pro-Sharia, you're pro the veil, you're pro-stoning. You're pro the death penalty for apostasy. And if you're not, well, you're not a real Muslim. How many times have we heard that? If you're Muslim and you've supported ex-Muslims, how many times have you heard that? You're not authentic enough. And really, when you look at identity politics, while it talks about including a group, it's actually meant to exclude, because it excludes everybody who doesn't agree with that narrow position of what an authentic identity is. And it focuses on creating difference, and there is a double-edged sword between the politics of difference and the politics of superiority. And we see this very clearly. It's no surprise that we have the rise of fascism in Europe and across the world, because this sort of identity politics feeds into white identity politics. And for me, this is the same movement. The Islamists and the white nationalists, they, if you look at their characteristics, I know they don't do exactly the same thing, but give the white nationalists enough power. And historically also we've seen what they've done. But they have very similar characteristics. Their reliance on violence, their reliance on misogyny, on anti-Semitism, on homophobia, their dreaming of some glorious past. The Islamists want the Caliphate, the white nationalists want a pure white Europe, as if that ever existed or will ever exist. So that sort of feeds into it. And this refusal to address Islam and the Islamism helps to feed into white nationalism as well. And I think the other important issue is that this idea that there's something called group rights, And, Muslims have rights. What about the individuals within that community? Are we the property of that community? Do we not also have the right to think differently, to live differently, to dress how we want, to show our ass on TV if we want, to go topless if we want, to become atheists if we want, to blaspheme if we want? And I think this is important. This idea of group rights really erases dissent, erases class politics, erases social and political movements that exist, and only holds this community or group as, the only thing that's worthy of respect. And, well, it's those in power that you're holding, you're respecting. It's their norms, their culture, their principles. And so we see a complete erasure of this sort of dissent. And we often hear about clash of civilizations. There's a clash between, Islam and the West. There's a clash between Islam and Christianity. And look, the reality is that Muslims have become so subhuman that you cannot see, I don't mean you, obviously you can see, but generally, people cannot seem to see that they're human just like everybody else. There is a clash in every family, in every neighborhood, in every society across the globe, just like we're fighting in Britain over Brexit. I hate Brexit, by the way, with a vengeance. And in America, they're fighting over Trump. And here you're fighting over your politics as well. What I mean is that this clash is not really a clash of civilizations. It's a clash, as Polly Toynbee said, who's a UK journalist. She said it's a clash between reason and superstition. And I say that it's a clash between secularists and theocrats. And so when and again, the other thing is, just because we're all ex-Muslims doesn't mean we all think alike. We have different politics in the same way that Muslims have different politics, in the same way that Norwegians have different politics. For me, I see the ex-Muslim movement not as another identity group, because I think identity politics is regressive. It denies our common humanity. It stops us from showing solidarity and empathy with people who are seen to be the other. I see it as a community in protest, like the civil rights movement in the United States, like the suffragist movement, like the LGBT rights movement, a movement for equality, not for difference, and not for superiority. And so with the ex-Muslim, because hashtag is something that one of our activists, Rehana Sultan, thought of, we started a hashtag asking people to say why they were ex-Muslim, and we thought a few hundred people would join in. And interestingly, over 120,000 tweets from 65 countries told us why people were ex-Muslim, from ex-Muslim because no 72 virgins for me, to ex-Muslim because of bacon. And of course, there were a lot more serious ones, but what I want to say is that movement was not just in the West. A lot of people answered it in countries under Islamic rule as well. Separately, we've seen things like proud to be atheist in Mecca. This is Rana Ahmad. She's a Saudi atheist who went and put the sign up while she was there. Just recently, I saw a video of an Iranian woman unveiled, showing her face. The hashtag behind her says anti-religion. And of course, in Sweden, you've got Alia Majd al-Mahdi, the Egyptian blogger who went to a conference on the hijab in Sweden and held a sign while she was topless saying hijab is racism, is sexism, not anti-racism. And of course, it's linked with the movement in Iran against compulsory veiling. You've got the movement in Turkey, the 10-year challenge, where women show a picture of themselves veiled, and then 10 years after that they're unveiled. You've seen this gorgeous image of a woman who's reached freely liberated Kurdish areas after having fled ISIS. And the color underneath that blackness and that fabric, which I think is like a fabric erasure of women's bodies. Fastifying is something that we've done in the UK. Here's a poster that was made by the Iranian regime calling me anti-revolutionary and a mercenary because I had a drink during Ramadan, yeah. So And it's linked to the fast-defying movement in a place like Tunisia, where young people are being beaten and arrested for eating, for smoking, for drinking during Ramadan. You have a right to fast if you want, but I also have a right not to fast and not to be hit and persecuted and jailed for not doing so. That's your religion, not mine. On the issue of periods, this is me and my darling Sadia Hamid from the Council of Eks-Muslims. We did an action against the taboo of the period. This gets a lot of discussion going, particularly in our countries, Pakistan and Iran and other countries. And of course, here's a poster from the Aurat March in Pakistan. Aurat is the part of your body, a woman's body, that you're not supposed to show. And they've called it an Aurat March in Pakistan. I think that's the most gorgeous thing. And one of the placards is, we want a period-friendly Pakistan. My body is not your battleground. Here's a video, a picture of women in Afghanistan. And the sign says, the dirty hands of the merchants of religion need to be cut from our country. And this is a protest for Farkhonde and Rokhshana, who were killed, one by mob rule and one by stoning. This is a kissing in Morocco by Iktisam Betty Lashkar. She's a Moroccan activist. There were some young couple kissing in Morocco. They were harassed and threatened when they did so. And so they had a public kissing as a form of resistance. Nude protest is another way of challenging this view that women's bodies is so filthy that it has to be veiled, it has to be covered up, otherwise it will cause fitna and chaos in society. This is us in front of the Louvre in Paris. We were arrested for it, by the way. I love this because I've actually cut the Allah out of the Iranian regime's flag and put something much more worthwhile in its place. And of course, nude protest is not something that's just Western. We hear that a lot. There are lots of efforts for social protests made by women from Africa to the Middle East and North Africa that includes nudity. And this is, of course, Amina Taylor from Tunisia. She was arrested as a result of her actions. And she was actually in the Paris protest that we had. And this was a campaign for her that we did along with Femen to have her released. On the issue of gender segregation, again, this is something we've been fighting for in Britain, and we know that it's something that people are fighting for in a place like Iran. You must have heard of the blue girl who set herself on fire because she was arrested for having tried to enter a football stadium dressed as a boy. And this is a song, I couldn't find the video, but it's a song football fans are singing. This is the football team that she liked, Esteghlal. And the song basically says there's no difference between man and woman. All of us are football lovers. And it's just such a great show of support for her and for women who want to enter football stadiums. We're protesting Sharia law in Britain. I can't go into the details of it, but maybe later if you're interested. And again, this is something that people are protesting elsewhere, the demand for secularism. This is a wonderful poster from the recent protests in Iraq, protests that are going on now. It says, rather, we should prefer separation of religion from the state to the separation of the sexes. And this is an amazing film footage of a protest in Iraq. But I don't know how to turn it on. Help! Oh, yeah. Okay, that was an ex-MNA poster, wasn't it? Thing. Sorry, now I have no idea how to get to my next slide. I really have some deficiency, but we won't talk about. Oh, escape. I'm not touching it. Stay with me. Okay, thank you. And this is another amazing poster of the Kurdish fighters in Rojava, in Syrian Kurdistan. They're tearing down a banner that was left there by ISIS. And Rojava has banned Sharia law, it has banned polygamy, it's banned child marriage, it's banned forced marriage, banned honor killings. I mean, this is a center of feminism and humanism and secularism in the world, under attack now by Turkish forces. So basically what I'm trying to show you is that it's not us and them. There are people who are migrants, who are here, who are fighting for these very, for the demand for secularism, for the demand for free thought, for the demand for atheism and apostasy and blasphemy. And there are people across the globe doing the same. There are many refugees who are also fighting this fight. And I think one of the things that quite upset me yesterday, I was meeting some people, and someone said to me that they want to go and live in Corsica because there's a sign there that says the only good Muslim is a dead one. And I'm sorry, I find that really frightening to hear that. I find it really upsetting because my family is Muslim, and if the point of fighting this fight is that we're all treated as human beings, not that some of us are dehumanized for different reasons. And I think it's really important that we fight for blasphemy, fight for apostasy, but at the same time also oppose racism and bigotry and dehumanizing anybody else. I mean, I think at the core of it, this fight should be a fight for our common humanity, for our universal rights. And of course, this is especially important given the rise of the far right across Europe and the West. So as a final thing, I want to say that, you have people excusing fundamentalism or excusing racism. I think, as a base, we have to agree that we'll never excuse bigotry because of fundamentalism, and at the same time, we will never, ever excuse fundamentalism because of bigotry. And that this fight, the fight for apostasy and blasphemy, is a fight, one of many fights that we have. And I think at its core, it's a fight for universal rights, for secularism, for equality, for feminism, for humanism. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope we have a good discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Maryam Namazie. Dagfinn, you started this event by addressing or sharing some thought about how or why we should be pessimists. And yes, the situation is really serious. The situation is violent. But I'm not pessimist. I'm optimist. I'm optimist because of Maryam Namazie. And I'm optimist because of our next speaker. And I'm so proud to introduce this bright girl from Pakistan living in America. So a warm applause for Sarah Haider.
Well, thank you, Shabana, for that lovely introduction. I'm really honored to be here and to be with Maryam and Shabana and speaking to you all today. Before I begin, I do want to spend a few short minutes describing myself and my work for Eks-Muslims in North America. We're a nonprofit based in the United States, and our mission is to advocate for the acceptance of religious dissent, promote secular values, and reduce discrimination faced by those who leave Islam. And we go about fulfilling this task with a variety of programs. We produce videos and documentaries, we organize events, especially on college campuses. And we foster support communities, and now we have we're present in over 25 metropolitan areas in the United States and Canada. We also engage in a wide variety of activism efforts. We work with governmental agencies and other nonprofits to raise awareness of issues related to blasphemy and the growing phenomena of ex-Muslims. Just this September, we organized a billboard campaign. This was the first of its kind. It was in 3 cities in the United States, featuring some of our ex-Muslim community members, not hidden, not hiding their identities, and the words on it, godless, fearless ex-Muslim. What I'm going to speak about here today, though, has less to do with Islam. It's indirectly related to Islam, but more to do with freedom. Freedom to think, freedom to speak, and freedom to organize. And the topics, as most of you are aware, of course, are not really unrelated. Just yesterday, I think some of you might have been at the same event. There was a conference on this topic exactly, freedom of speech in the context of Islam. And if the many conferences and events that we have relating to this topic are indicative of anything, we know that for the past few years, there's been a resurgence of interest in the topic. And I think as a direct consequence of the collisions of free speech in Islam, highlighted by the terrorist episodes, the murders of cartoonists in France and Denmark. And hanging over these discussions is the politically relevant context, of course, the arrival of immigrants in greater numbers than we've seen before in the West, particularly from the Muslim world. And collision with the other can be quite messy, as we know, and lead to great tragedies. It can give rise to nationalists, racists, supremacists who want to retain the old order. It is also, as these matters tend to be, an opportunity for some great good, for the intermingling of the best of different cultures. And as we get to understand how we are different, it's also an opportunity for those of us in the West to reflect and appreciate traditions that have strengthened our pursuit of equality, dignity, and prosperity. And the very best and very fundamental of these traditions is the ability to speak freely. In the common understanding, there is a distinction made between the freedom of speech and the freedom of thought. I argue that these concepts are not distinct, really, in the most fundamental sense, that on the grand scheme of things, they do serve similar functions and are indeed the same. We know of speech primarily as expression. Maryam illustrated all the ways in which freedom of speech was an artistic expression and an expression of dissent as a way of manifesting what is in our hearts and minds. But of course, speech is not just expression, it serves a function of communication, which is a higher order kind of thinking. We have 2 ways of thinking as human animals. We think alone in our heads, and we think together using language. We speak, we discuss, maybe in panels and discussions like this one. What we are doing here is thinking together as a kind of multi-brained organism. And this higher order kind of thinking has led to all the progress of mankind. Men have individual thoughts. Mankind as a whole has traditions of philosophies that have developed through critique, through discussion, through debate over thousands of years. Man alone has single idea. Mankind together has scientific breakthroughs that depend on 1,000 other scientific breakthroughs, a mountain of progress that could not have been achieved by one man. When the Catholic Church persecuted Galileo as a heretic, they didn't just stop one man from speaking. They interfered and attempted to strangle that higher order thinking, in which Galileo was just one participant. Through public dialogue, these ideas of men lead to magnificent feats and allow us to achieve even a kind of immortality. And this is why we must be so vigilant when in our societies we see through laws or through social prohibitions and pressure the erosion of free and unfettered speech. This is why we must be fundamentalists of a kind when it comes to free speech, because it is not just about artistic expression. Free speech is the ability of our societies to think and therefore to prosper. And I will come back to this point again and again because I just don't think that the stakes here are understood properly. Without our tradition of unrestrained discourse, we would not be living in such a free and bountiful society. A tradition of open expression also makes claims about knowledge. That is to say, it says that we accept on some level that we don't have the whole truth just yet about the reality of the world, that we are not perfect moral beings at the moment. And an open civil society is the only tool we have of getting to know more, of getting better. Which is also why free speech is the ultimate insult to God, and why theocracies across history have had to put it mildly, an unfriendly relationship with free inquiry and speech. The insult is not just that we allow ourselves to make light of what religions consider sacred by poking fun of them, but by opening up a free society, we deny the very fundamental claim of revelation, that we admit that we don't yet have the perfect absolute truth. In the Quran, it says, I have some verses here. Absolutely, this is the narration of truth. Absolutely, there is no God except God. The word of your Lord is complete, in truth and in justice. Nothing shall abrogate his words. He is the hearer, the omniscient. Later, the Quran could not possibly be authored by anyone other than God. It confirms all previous messages. It provides a fully detailed scripture. It is infallible, for it comes from the Lord of the universe. This is a scripture whose verses have been perfected, then elucidated. It comes from the most wise, most cognizant. But the Quran isn't alone, right? Its Abrahamic cousins also claim exclusive access to knowledge. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And in John, we know that they say God's word is truth. The fundamental claim of religion is God's possession of absolute infallible knowledge, a monopoly on what truth is and of how to find it. Religion isn't the only authority, of course, that wishes to have such a monopoly. Fascists of all kinds want the same thing, which is why they too abhor free speech. Historically, we know that restrictions of speech are used by those in power who have power and want to hold on to this power. And I want to add that the reason progress in the Muslim world is suspended is not due to the lack of visionaries and intellect and heroes in the Muslim world. There are many of them. It is instead that the Muslim world is held hostage by a religion which holds dominion over it, over knowledge and thus speech. Blasphemy prevents scientists, human rights activists, artists to express themselves without fear. It creates a chokehold on progress. Muslims are therefore unable to undertake this higher order collective thinking, unfettered. And good ideas die in the minds where they are created, unable to be shared, unable to be built upon. So is it a surprise that we see in the Muslim world such sad levels of scientific and moral achievements? So let's discuss some of the ways in which we interfere with the ability to think on this higher order, the hard and the soft ways we restrict expression. The clearest example, I think, which we all know about, is blasphemy laws. And because I think we're all familiar with it, I won't go over it very much. While we do not have legislative restrictions on discourse in the West so severely, we certainly have other forms of suppression. There is a reason no one draws cartoons of the Prophet. There is a reason that I can stand up here and take the Quran and take the Bible and rip pages out of it, but I cannot do so of the Quran. Whether we like it or not, this is a de facto blasphemy law, guaranteed not by the power of government, but by the power of vigilante violence. Our society is formed around the idea that no one has the right to tell us what to hold sacred, but they have told us, and we have submitted to their will. What I want to focus on today are some of the softer ways also that speech is restricted, less blatant, more ephemeral, ways that are much more easier to accept in a Western context. These are seemingly benevolent forms of speech restrictions which root their justifications in more compassionate and humanist terms. One form restricts what we can say, the other restricts who can speak. So let's start with the laws and social prohibitions around so-called hate speech. Again, I'm referring here, just for the sake of time, both for laws and social prohibitions. These norms deny that they have anything to do with maintaining power over discourse. They instead explain to us, rather condescendingly, that these laws are actually the benefit of the powerless. The thinking goes that those who are harmed by hate speech have no power to throw around themselves. This is why the speech restrictions and social norms must protect them. We will protect the most vulnerable from this vile, antagonistic speech. But of course, the black and white dichotomy of powerful and powerless is absurd at the very face of it. Certainly, the group that finds itself the target of hate might have less power than other groups, but the ability to impose the restriction itself requires a degree of social and cultural power, right? For example, right, the minorities and women have been able to demand speech restrictions for hurtful and offensive speech today. But this is only after an improvement in status. The very same concerns would have been ridiculed only a few decades ago. The very obvious reality is that the most powerful in our powerless in our society do not even yet have the status of victims. Ex-Muslims are an example of such a group. We will discover, as we have for hundreds of years, that there are classes being persecuted unjustly in our world that we either do not see or refuse to acknowledge the existence of. But you might say, so what if speech restrictions are a power play so long as there's a disparity? The restrictions might help ease the stresses and burdens of those who are less powerful than others, so why not have them? And here's where we must again examine the relationship between speech and the monopoly of knowledge. Speech restrictions of any sort make a claim about knowledge. They do. They say that the institution or individual that is imposing the restriction is able to judge accurately the direction and the intensity of power relations. We imagine this kind of, and hope, that this kind of censorship protects the weak, but this assumes that we know who the weak are and are willing to acknowledge their suffering. It assumes a benevolent and omniscient authority. So for one, those in power often do not acknowledge the injustices faced by the weak when it is in their benefit to not acknowledge them. Dissenters from Muslim backgrounds, again, are a great example of this, both in the East and in the West. But secondly, those in the power are not omniscient, of course, and they cannot be relied on to not harm others by their restrictions or to create a backlash which could amplify hatred tenfold. These hate speech restrictions are not always a matter of the law. Many times such forces are just socially enforced, as I said. Individuals who breach these social conventions, in this case to criticize the religion of what is considered a poor, vulnerable minority, are punished socially, dealing with severe damage to their reputations, charged of favoring far-right politics. For ex-Muslims, this social prohibition is doubly harmful. As many of us intimately understand the problems within the Muslim faith, such norms make it near impossible to address the source of our suffering, and thus make it impossible for us to find justice. So this is one way in which we indirectly hamper discourse. Another, as Maryam mentioned in her speech as well, is the confusion identity politics brings to our discourse. But I want to clarify before I go on that I'm not necessarily an opponent of identity-based organizing per se. And what I mean by that is that throughout history, persecuted groups of all stripes have come together to address the very specific discrimination they face as persons who share that identity, because they share that identity, whether that be race or gender or sexuality. An example of this might be the American Civil Rights Movement. But politics around identity all make claims of difference between their group and the outside world. The American Civil Rights Movement claimed that while we are all part of the human race, some of us are treated differently and unjustly. What makes the toxic breed of identity politics distinct is that the difference acknowledged is not just one of treatment. We are being treated differently, but we are all the same. But the difference, the claim is one of exclusive access to certain kinds of knowledge bestowed directly by identity, and access that cannot be transferred. There is a tendency to treat identity as a source of unquestionable revelation. Of course, it's true that identity is relevant. Certainly, in the cases of minorities of all stripes have knowledge based in experience, which is valuable and provides us with new information or unique or forgotten or overlooked perspectives. And certainly life experience and perspectives are worth serious and compassionate consideration. But identity has become something of what I call an epistemic qualification, which is to say, if you do not have the right identity or experience, you are not allowed to speak freely on a topic. This tendency is often not voiced directly in the terms that I just stated it, but the logic is present everywhere. Your race, your sex, your life experiences determine where you can or cannot speak. And it's due to this reasoning, the identity of a person making a claim becomes as important as the claim itself. right? Identity grants you access to certain topics of discourse. It can also be a shield from criticism by those who don't share that access. Holders of certain identities are by fiat holders of truths related to that identity. And criticizing an idea derived from this exclusive access leads to charges of criticizing the validity of the identity itself. As an illustration, consider the example of the Muslim American activist Linda Sarsour, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with her, but Linda wears a hijab, and she acts as a representative to Muslim America. And when Jake Tapper, an acclaimed and respected CNN anchor, criticized Sarsour and her choices with an organization she was affiliated with, her instinctive response was to paint him as one who targets her because of her identity as a Muslim, calling him, who is Jake Tapper, who is a tireless campaigner against the misbehavior of the Trump administration. She called him alt-right. When Tapper referenced prior unsavory comments by her in the same engagement, she responded, "Please share my ugly sentiments. Am I too unapologetically Muslim, unapologetically Palestinian, pro-immigrant, pro-justice?" And this was not the first time she uses identity to deflect criticism. At an event earlier that same year, an attendee asked her to explain the same unsavory comments to give the context. I'll explain what those comments are. These are tweets that she shared on Twitter, stating that she wishes she could take the vaginas away of two women who criticized Islam. Sarsour added that they don't deserve to be women, in her opinion. Note the desire here to strip away the identity of people who disagree with her politically. We'll get more to this in depth later. So anyway, she was at this event, and a young man came up to her to ask her about these comments. He said, here's what he said. "Hi, so this question is really important because I believe that women's rights are also human rights. So I really want to know, under what circumstances is it acceptable to say that I wish I could take their vaginas away? They don't deserve to be women." Just to give that context, that's one of your tweets off of your Twitter. That's what this young man said. Sarsour's response to this young man was again to use identity both as a shield and as a weapon. Here's what she responded. So let's give some context here, because we have, this is an event organized by an Asian American, right? Let's just get some context of what is going on here. Celebrating a community, right? Talking about communities of color who are being directly impacted by this moment. And I have a young white man in the back who is not directly impacted by any of the issues I mentioned. And that was it. That was the response. All she had to do was just deflect criticism, was to point at her race, point at her gender and her background, and to the race and gender of the questioner. I will assume that this group in particular is aware that there are some things that, due to the color of your skin or to your sex that you're born with, you feel as if you cannot say. And I encounter this every single day, and people talk to me about this every single day. Sometimes from people who are very angry about this whole state of affairs. They feel discriminated against due to their race. And sometimes I hear this from concerned and compassionate people who just don't want to intrude or clumsily misconstrue or offend a vulnerable identity group. One would assume that using the logic of this toxic brand of identity politics, that ex-Muslims have free reign to speak. That as brown people, as women of color, so like myself, Maryam and Shabana, we can get away with saying things that others cannot. But here's where it gets a little interesting. Yes, your identity can grant you exclusive knowledge and exclusive access to certain claims of discourse, to certain realms of discourse, but what happens when people who share skin color, experience, and nationality say things that contradict each other? Whose experience and identity-based truth counts as real? As a way of alleviating this difficulty, proponents of identity politics will bring in questions of authenticity. And Maryam touched on this as well. As a way of dismissing our identities. Ex-Muslims are routinely dismissed as inauthentic. We are accused of never having been Muslims in the first place. We are accused of being paid actors. We are accused of lying for some kind of fame or acceptance from the West. Anything to cast doubt on our authenticity as former Muslims. when that identity is racial, there are efforts to draw boundaries and crystallize distinctions that activists had worked once upon a time to dismantle. For example, when Ayaan Hirsi Ali, fierce and controversial critic of Islam, herself a Somali woman and former Muslim, was disinvited from an engagement at Yale, a student group who, in defending their choice to oppose her speech, claimed that she does not represent, quote, the totality of the ex-Muslim experience. This is very interesting, right? It begs the question, who does? Which one of us represents the totality of the ex-Muslim experience? And who are they chosen by? It illustrates, quite simply, this affair, that despite the lip service to the preeminence of identity and experience, even its proponents utilize it as merely a political tool. Because when faced with someone with the right identity credentials, but the wrong ideas, they scramble to take those credentials away, revealing that even they don't believe that identity or experience necessarily confers any unquestionable unique wisdom or truth. Identity epistemics claim that they're legitimized by the authority of experience, but it is clear that instead it's an aspiration to power that is beyond question. It's similar to what we've seen before with religious groups. And I know that both hate speech prohibitions and identity politics are sympathetic to people from a humanist background, and this is why I wanted to address them specifically. We understand why good people might want to promote both. But if the threats to free speech all come in cartoonishly hideous and obvious forms, they wouldn't need discussion, they wouldn't need protection, and we wouldn't need to be championing them. Free inquiry, true and unfettered inquiry, guarantees in a way that no liberty can, that power will remain decentralized, and that we as a society can find and agree on truth together. Our desire to maintain free societies, to protect those less powerful than ourselves, obligates us to resist the pull of expedient solutions that restrict speech, but instead to go forward to expand the envelope of free speech, however we can. Thank you.
So the part was addressing racism, and the audience understood it, and everything was fine. But then it exploded in social media, where people who haven't seen the play said it was racism, that we were using blackface, and it was a racistic play. So they haven't seen it, and they were treating me as I was a white Nazi who had produced the show. There were two brown comedians who actually helped the students to put up this show. But because of the identity politics, because they have just decided that this is a racist show, they didn't want to see what I shared with you now. They didn't want to understand the fact about what the play was about. And that went so far that I was receiving death threats because of a school play. And I have done a lot of things in the public, and I received death threats, but because of this, because of doing a political correct anti-racistic school play. So I have to ask, what happened? What is this about? Because this was new to even me in the Norwegian public. I was used to hear that, okay, you're anti-Islam, or you are, against your own people, or, all that critique we meet when we talk openly. But these things were totally new to me, to be claimed as a racist. For me, it was new because I think the identity politics and the racist debates now is being used to stop needed cultural and religious critique as well. And we have to address that. Because we are not racist, like Maryam so beautifully addressed it as well. The issues we are addressing, the critics we are raising, are for our own people, not against them. It's for equality, for ourselves as a pluralistic society. But this debate was so hard, so difficult. I was used to it. So I was standing with all these charges. But I have talked to people who cried, who didn't know how to handle these things. And people in front of you are not dealing with facts, but have decided where to put you, by color, by gender, or sometimes not even that, by what they decided if you are privileged or underprivileged. So who are making these decisions? Who have the right to define us and split us like this? For me, this is really serious, and for me, will be a big challenge for comedians, for activists, for painters, for everyone, but also for the communities we belong to don't accept it. To don't accept fake news like this. And it's going to be harder. Yes, I'm still optimist, but I have seen people be destroyed by these charges. Being called a racist in our society now is one of the worst things. And in a social media storm, where people you thought were your friends, showing you their back and say, no, you work with racists. No matter what your explanation is, no matter if you want to show them the play or what you actually have written, what you stand for, it doesn't help. The identity politics blinds people. And that's a serious threat to multicultural societies, where you need to express yourself. You need, to travel between identities, to experiment, to be creative. I'm going to show you another thing I did for some years ago, because, yes, to address, to talk about, to make jokes, in Islam or in Muslim communities, it's a dangerous thing to do. And we have to normalize it. And lots of people are doing it. And you have to be smarter and smarter. I haven't touched like the Prophet and the Quran in my comedy. And a lot of people think I received the death threats I was receiving during my comedy shows was because I lifted a mullah. But you know what? I never received a single death threat because of the mullah lifting. Because everyone laughed, even in Kurdistan. What I did receive death threats for is every time I make jokes and show and demonstrate that I'm owning my body. The body paintings, the moonings, the jokes about sex. That's when people were triggered. That's when the worst sexism, the worst attacks came from. To be a free woman, to own your sexuality, that also means to own your freedom of speech. But one time I did touch the Quran. So the thing was, there were a lot of issues at that time, and I think there was someone in the US who said that a pastor or something, that he was going to burn the Quran. And I think even there's some people who were killed in Afghanistan because of that. He said that. So I was invited to a Norwegian literal festival, a book festival, to talk about dangerous books.
Kjære publikum, helt til slutt så vil jeg gjerne komme med en appell. Det burde være flere bokbål i dette landet. Dette er Koranen. Den boka har kanskje mer makt enn noen annen bok i vår tid. Hvis jeg brenner den, da vil du kanskje få enda mer makt. Det burde være flere bokbål i dette landet. Det burde det. Ikke vær redd for at boka di blir brent. Vær heller redd for at den ikke blir brent. Tusen takk for meg. Nyt festivalen!
I'm not going to explain this, but this is, as a comedian, as a comedian, I wanted to touch the subject of the non-touchable and how to do it. We should challenge ourselves all the time. If I would have gone further and actually burned the book, that will not be comedy. That will not be satire. For me, maybe for someone else, I don't know. But we have to challenge ourselves and twist. So this was a stunt called that I'm threatening to not burn the Quran. And the funny thing is, I laughed because when I was holding the Quran and threatening to not burn it, the people in the audience were so afraid. They were like, just the thought of it. They didn't done anything wrong. And then the lunatics showed, when they saw this video, they get so mad. You didn't burn the Quran. I'm so angry, but you didn't. Vi have a break. Tusen takk for meg. Tusen takk til Maryam og Sarah. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to have a panel discussion, but I think the ladies really also want to be in a dialogue with you. So we will maybe pretty soon start the Q&A as well. Just to start the discussion, since you heard me say that I'm an optimist and I want to be an optimist, could you please start with share what kind of support you have met since since you started your journey of free speech and addressing this issue? Are we heading to the right direction? Just share what kind of support and feedback you're receiving. in each continent. Sarah, will you start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's easy to just focus on the ways in which we are struggling and things are difficult. But I do think that the ex-Muslim movement in general, and this is where I drive my sense of optimism and hope, is that there are so many people from within the Muslim community and in the Muslim world who are standing up and who are taking great risks to be heard, and to speak freely and openly and to change their communities. I didn't think that was possible, or maybe I just didn't know. Yeah, and for a long time, I think a lot of ex-Muslims just think that they're entirely alone, and we were not sure of the kind of support we'll receive. But with ex-Muslims in North America, there's just been a flood of people who want to participate and who are seeking support in our communities. It's something that I could never have imagined or predicted. And so when I think of hope, I don't know about the broader Western dialogue. That's something I'm hoping to affect and change. At the same time, my focus and my sense of optimism really comes from the Muslim world and from Muslim communities, because I feel like they are far more willing to accept us and to really deal with the challenges that we present than we expect. In the Western dialogue, it's just the most extreme people are the ones who represent us. They're the ones who speak on our behalf. And so I think we have this impression that this is the way the Muslim world is, and this is the way it will always be. And even if it is the case that the Muslim world is, in the moment, intolerant, there's no reason why that has to remain, and that has to be that way. So I think we're seeing a change, and I think the people here are a part of that change.
I want to add to that what Sarah said, and I think for me there is a great deal of optimism. That's how huge my optimism is. It's so huge. And I think if you're an activist, you have to be an optimist, because how else could you think you can change the world? If you're a pessimist, you'll just go under your covers and stay there for as long as you can. So I think it's always, that saying, seeing the glass half empty or half full. I think as an activist, you do see it as full, half full at least. And I think a lot of our support has come from other minorities, as Sarah said, from people who come from the so-called Muslim world. I don't like to call it the Muslim world, because in the same way I don't like to call Europe the Christian world, because there's so much diversity of opinion in Europe, as there is also in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia. Huge, long histories of tradition of fighting against religious dogma and religious rule. What I tried to show in my talk is the fact that this is so widespread. And what's happened is that as a result of identity politics, we're not seeing that. We only know the Islamists and the fascists, whereas there are so many who are fighting in our corner, but we don't see them as allies because identity politics has divided us as such. So I feel, the more we can support each other, the stronger we're going to feel. And I think, when you look at the ex-Muslim movement, I remember in 2007 when we started the Council of Ex-Muslims, there was a few ex-Muslims in the balcony. They didn't want to be filmed. There were some people who came to the conference and said, but where are the ex-Muslims? And is this really an issue? The Guardian journalist asked, aren't you just causing problems? There are no ex-Muslims around. And I think what in 12 years we've seen is that actually, per the Iranian regime's own words, there is a tsunami of atheism taking place. You have the Saudi government equating atheism with terrorism. You have the Egyptian government working to eliminate atheism via the Ministry of Youth and the Ministry of Education. They're putting together a plan to do that. So what that does show is that it's something that concerns them as well. And I think as a result of social media, we're able to see this amazing resistance in a way we wouldn't ever have been able to see it before. So I think the least we can do is to defend it, to support it, and to see it as our own struggle.
But I have something to add, just to add into that point of what we were talking about, optimism. And this idea, I want to push back against it a little bit because I feel that we think about, and I encountered a lot of people who are just, they feel hopeless. They think what you're doing here has no chances of success. And therefore, I'm going to put my efforts in, some other alternative social movement. Because this right here, this is doomed for failure. You're facing too much. On the one hand, we actually don't know that, right? We don't know when it is and what it is that sparks the first flame that leads to a monumental change in a society. We don't know that. And if we look through history, we study history, it would have been hard to predict in those moments when you were living through that part of history that you would see these changes. I didn't think that in the United States we would see a black president in 2008, and then we did. And I didn't think that we would have gay marriage as quickly as we did in a country that's very religious, and then suddenly we did. And it blindsided me when it happened because I'm not omniscient. And neither are you, and neither is anyone. So I think the only thing that should be in the forefront of our minds, what is the right thing to do here? It doesn't matter whether or not, this idea of we're going to estimate the chances of success here, it doesn't matter. This is the right thing to do. And even if you could look forward into the future, somehow you divine what's about to happen, and you knew that dissenters from the Muslim world were going to fail, you should still support them when they start to speak up, because it's the right thing to do.
Yes, just the right thing to do and stand in it, through the storms and just see. But, it's not the visibility in social media. Maryam, you actually are doing something really physical. You are having these yearly gatherings, which you had in Amsterdam, which was magical, where you are inviting activists from all over the world and supporting them and, making a whole new solid platform so they can recognize each other and become a family, a supportive group. And that group are actually, it's raising and becoming more and more people. Can you tell me about this gathering?
Yeah, I mean, Sarah and Mohammed were there. There were ex-Muslims from all over the world. Shabana was there, and I think the issue is that people do feel very alone. They feel under attack, and they feel desperate sometimes and hopeless. And I think the only way we can counter hopelessness is to bring hope. And to do that, we need to feel that there are many of us, to know that we're not alone. And I think that is important for any struggle for social change, for human rights and welfare. So I think, a sort of bringing people together, it's important because, when you're together, you feel stronger as well, and it helps you sort of take a break from all the attacks that you face on a daily basis. But it also shows you the sheer numbers that we have and how much we're all making a huge dent in whatever area we're working at, and how it sort of feeds into each other, strengthens each other. So I do think that sort of bringing together activists is really important, and we need to recharge our batteries as well, and just seeing each other is just really fun.
And witnessing each other's stories, and there were intellectuals, there were artists, it's a broad spectrum of different people addressing the same issues. But there were also believers there.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main positions that we take at the Council of Ex-Muslims. I know XMNA do that as well, and a lot of ex-Muslim groups, not all, but a lot of them do take that position where, look, this is not about us ex-Muslims against Muslims, because, it can never be that way. It's, if you're fighting for gay rights, it's not us gay people against straight people.
Right.
If you're fighting for women's rights, it's not about us women against men. We have to work together if we're going to change the world, and there are many of us, and I think we need to see the world in that way. And I think it's important. Look, if you're fighting for a fight that wants to humanize each other, to recognize each other's common humanity, then we have to do that. There's no other way. because we don't want to be the same as those who are trying to silence and suppress us. The point is to show a different way of doing things, that's human rights based, that's secular based, that's humanism based. So I think, that is really important to do. And I think just doing that makes people feel more hopeful as well, because you do then, if you can see it beyond us and them, it does open the world for you. And it does open, the numbers of people that can stand with you, and not just your little, very small identity or group.
So let's dig a little bit into what is actually provoking, because it all sounds hopeful, it's good, it should be supported by so many more. We will come into how to be more effective to, make this community grow, but still there are also many people who are provoked. Your street activism, like I told that mullah lifting was okay, but owning your own body is so not okay. What is that, and how to handle with that in a free world where we also here, are receiving threats and are calling all kind of things?
I mean, all social change is provocation when it first begins. Everything that we now call, human rights, equality and dignity was once, at some time, a kind of a heresy. But we worked through that. We've understood that there are emotional responses. Of course there are emotional responses. Everyone feels, we hold specific things close to our hearts, and when they are challenged, we have an emotional response. We feel offended. But we have to understand that feeling of offense in itself doesn't mean anything. Because we might have been offended 50 years ago if someone said that women should be a part of the workforce. We might have taken offense at that. And in fact, many people did. There were, when suffragettes were standing up, in the United States at least, there were women who were fighting against it. Women who were saying, no, women should not have the right to vote. I mean, it sounds crazy now, but at the time, it really was an open question. It really was open to discussion. So we have to some degree, understand that our feelings on these issues, our resistance towards one idea or another, maybe it's reasonable, or maybe it's rooted in something real, or maybe it's just a reaction because this is something we're uncomfortable with. And we have to learn to navigate that difference.
I mean, I think also adding to that, there is often this insistence that we focus on the death threats and the intimidation. It's constant, how many threats do you get? What sort of threats do you get? Don't worry about it, okay? I'm still alive, all right? So let's just move on, yeah? And I think the thing is, it is this sort of, it leaves everything, if you focus on the threats and intimidation, it leaves everything in the playing field of the Islamists, because that's how they move forward, is through fear, through intimidation. That's how they silence, and I think that's why it makes it important to sort of, okay, yes, that's a reality, in the same way that if you get on a plane, sometimes you're worried it's going to crash. I always do, or if you have a child and your child goes out, you can only think of the worst things that could possibly happen. But you just carry on, don't you? It doesn't stop you from getting on a plane or letting your poor child leave the house, because that's how it works. And I think with this as well, it's sort of like, okay, that's one aspect of it. But if you only see that aspect, you're seeing what they want you to see. But there's this whole other world of people who are fighting at great risk to themselves that we can't seem to see because of this sort of, acceptance of their narrative. So I do think this has a huge impact on how we even talk about this and how we push forward this movement. I mean, at Gay Pride, for example, a lot of our events actually, a lot of people never wanted to come. And then they saw we had one event and we were still alive, and we had 2 events and we were still alive, and we had 100 events and we're still alive, and we're going to outlive them for sure. So I think that makes people feel, yes, it's okay. And that's part of what you were talking about, normalizing dissent, opening up that space. And I honestly think, I know it's a bit cheeky of me to say, and I'm sure a lot of people won't agree with me, but I do think that we've also opened up the space for Muslim reformers and Muslim secularists. You know, a lot of them came after we came. And, you know, the thing is that you open the space for atheists and ex-Muslims, you open the space for everyone who wants to think differently. And I think that's why it's key for everyone to do it.
I agree. I think it's so important to be visible and to be visible that you're actually living a normal life. You know, and that's okay, because that's what the propaganda is about, that if they don't threat you, they say that it will, you know, your life will be destroyed, you will never be accepted, you live in a racist culture, and all that stuff you're trying to destroy and stop your journey to find yourself and to be a part of the society. So that just to be visible with your laughter, your activism, your celebrations or whatever, it's actually an active choice we have to make, and social media is actually helping us with that, to show that we are living normal, equal life, and it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, I think what Maryam brought up there was really, like, I agree with you entirely in that we have opened up the space for reformers and for a lot of Muslims who think differently. But why? We've done this because the apostasy stigma, the word, you're a kafir, you're an apostate, you're not an unbeliever, had such power, enough power to isolate you from your community. It still has that to some degree, and that's what we're fighting. But it has the power to take away your very life.
Yeah,
and
dignity.
If we say that we're going to stand up anyway, right? That power, that label, we will not let this hurt us. We will stand up anyway. And all those people who were smeared with that label, all the people in between in that spectrum, the Muslims, the reformist Muslims, the progressive Muslims, they can stand up too, because they're not as afraid of that label, the way that we have been up until now.
I think also, you know, like you were into now, that people who are really agree with us find the courage to take the microphone, because they say, okay, women with my background, women of color, can speak their mind. But not everyone are speaking their mind independently, you know. Many of them are spokespersons for ideology or the religion. But, you know, one of the issues keep coming back is that, okay, this is Western feminism, this is Eastern feminism, this is Islamic feminism. Do you have any comments on all this different feminism which are actually dividing us?
Well, I have a lot to say about Islamic feminism, and that could be a discussion on its own. I take a somewhat strict view in that I think that there are claims that feminism makes that are not they're just not necessarily things that meld well with Islamic orthodoxy. Having said that, are there people who ignore that tension and move on anyway? Of course they do, right? They say that I'm a Muslim and I'm a feminist, and more power to them. I do think, however, it's worth acknowledging that there is a tension there, and there are ways in which it doesn't come together, and we need to think about why and what that means. And when I, talk to Muslim feminists who, they're doing something, my heart breaks for them, because they're trying, and I appreciate that, and their heart's in the right place of finding within the text permission to be liberals and be feminists. But I think we need to be able to say that I don't need this to agree with me on this issue, and move on anyway, right? So we're trying to make them both fit, but look, they don't have to fit. That the secular values, the feminist women's rights, equal rights values stand on their own, and they're powerful and moving on their own, and they don't need justification within the Quran to be valuable to everyone, including Muslims.
I mean, yeah, completely agree. But I think also there's some other points that I'd like to add, which is one that this idea that feminism is a Western construct. And we hear this all the time, you know, human rights is a Western construct. There are no gays in Iran, that's what Ahmadinejad said. Well, why is there a death penalty against gay people if there are no gays in Iran? You know, we hear this all the time, and it's interesting because this is always an argument when it comes to human rights, and particularly women's rights, because women are seen to be extensions of the community, of national honor, of male honor, and you know, property, and especially when it comes to women's rights. So the example I always give is, you know, the Iranian regime wants nuclear technology. It never says this is a Western technology. You know, we don't want it. It never says that. It uses the latest advances, technological advances, to kill Iranian people, to torture them. The latest technology. I don't know. I can't say the word. Technological advances. Sorry. But when it comes to human rights and women's rights in particular, suddenly these are Western. And I think the problem is that because of identity politics, you have some feminists, and again, not all feminists, some feminists saying it. You know, the example I gave at Goldsmiths, where the feminist society was siding with the Islamic society, because, you know, that's their culture, that's their religion, we have to respect it. The thing about culture and religion is that it's a lived experience. It changes all the time as well. When I was a Muslim, when you were a Muslim, I'm sure, you know, no one gave us the book to read. We were just born. We happened to be born in Iran, you happened to be born in Pakistan, and that's it. You're a Muslim. That stamp comes on your forehead. You know, so when actually I learned about Islam after I became an ex-Muslim, because I saw the effects of it in Iran. And I was like, no, this is definitely not what my dad's been telling me. But my dad actually believes it too, because he too, well, maybe he, not him, but other people may not have even read a lot of the Quran. And that's why you find Muslims arguing things which are in the Quran and Hadith and saying it's not there. But because we're just born into a situation. And I think most of us are better than the religions we're born in, which thankfully so, otherwise it would be World War 1000. So I think that's one point. And the other point is that, you know, I agree with Islamic feminism. I think it's an oxymoron. You either defend Islam or you defend feminism. You can't defend religion and feminism, because religion is the height of misogyny. It's the height of being anti-woman. All religions are the case. So, you know, for me, I think if you look at the arguments of Islamic feminists, you know, just objectively, if you look at them, they are a defense of Islam. They are not a defense of women's rights and feminism. And I think that's something that needs to be very clear. I do, however, think that there are feminists who are Muslims. I do. And I think that there are people who, you know, are culturally Muslim or might be very pious. We have many of them working with us on the One Law for All campaign against Sharia law. But you know, the difference is that their being believers and me being an unbeliever is that we meet via secularism. And we believe that regardless of our beliefs, we are secularists and we believe in the separation of religion from the state, and that religion doesn't have a say in women's rights, it doesn't have a say in gay rights, it doesn't have a say in children's rights, animal rights. You know, and I think that's where so many of us can meet, and I think that's where we need to really, that's one of the areas where believers and non-believers really can work together for change.
You know, also tonight we are breaking the us and them, because there's us three being here with, you know, people who invited us here is quite unusual in Norway as well. So this is also actually a new thing, and we are very grateful for that. Maybe you have some comments on the invitation from the Human-Etisk Internationals and the Norwegian humanists and atheists.
Well, I'm ecstatic that there is support for us. I mean, it hasn't always been the case, and I think the ex-Muslim movement and, you know, my organization, we do see different shades of this in different countries. I don't know about the specific politics of Norway, but that in the American context, we've felt abandoned by people who should see our cause as their cause, right? And I've had people from humanist organizations in the United States come up to me and ask me, how can we support ex-Muslims? We don't have a lot of ex-Muslims in our organizations. Well, how can we pull them in? And I say, just take their issues and make them your own. These are your issues. Mm-hmm. This is the same battle, it's just on a different front. And you have to recognize that and take up the arms and fight alongside ex-Muslims, and ex-Muslims will join. Mm-hmm. And there will be no need for separate organizations that cater specifically to this religion. So this is wonderful, and I'm so glad that we're here and invited. Thank you to the Norwegian Humanists and Atheists.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I do feel quite abandoned by humanists in general, especially coming from the British context. So I'm so happy that we have this coming together of atheists and humanists. I think it's so important to do that, and I thank you really for leading the way in this, and I hope that we see this in other countries as well. I'm going to leave it at that, but I am going to just reiterate what Sarah said, is that, you know, the fight for the Enlightenment, the fight for against religious dogma, superstition, against clericalism, that is something that has been a banner for so long, that's been carried by atheists, by freethinkers, by humanists and seculars. You know, this is happening now in countries under Islamic rule. And I think really those who understand secularism and humanism and atheism most are those living under the boot of the religious right. No one can understand it better than them, no one. You know, because everything you do in your life is affected by theocracy. It's not about being a vocal atheist, it's about how you dress, it's about what music you listen to, who you have sex with, who you love. You know, it's every aspect of your life theocracies are involved in and are trying to silence and suppress. So the resistance is so great. And if we have internationally humanists and atheists showing solidarity and supporting people on the front lines of this battle, I don't think anyone can stop us, really. And I think that is key, that solidarity is key. I do think it's still missing. I think a lot of it has to do with, you know, fear of being labeled racism. And I'm glad we're afraid to be labeled racism, though I think that's changing with the rise of the far right. You know, yesterday I heard someone say, I'm proud to be called a racist. Well, I'm sorry, I would never be proud to be called a racist, never, never. And I think, you know, thank you for all those before us who fought this fight against racism that makes us so careful. It's important, but we need to remember blasphemy is not racism. Apostasy is not racism. And that as people, we are so complex. We have so many characteristics that define us. We can fight on many fronts. We can fight racism, we can fight fascism, and we can fight the religious right and Islamism.
This is the perfect time to open up for Q&A. Mm-hmm. So if you have any question, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for very interesting introductions today. Now I will go straight to my question. That's the challenge of defending your enemy. And we have a problem in Norway with ex-Muslims joining up with those who are not fighting Islamists around the world, but object to the immigration of Muslims to Norway. That is Islamophobia and it is racism. It is a very sad situation because it puts critique of religion on a par with xenophobia and racism. So my question is, how do you handle this problem? How do you defend the right of your enemies, right-wing extremists and Islamists, to be who they are, to practice their religion the way they want, as long as they do not harm others, both in North America and in Britain? Thank you.
Yeah. I think, first of all, I'm really sorry. But I think this idea of defending your enemy, why are people enemies just because they have a different belief than us, you know. And I think even that framing of that question is problematic because it always frames it between an us and them. But I do understand what you're saying. I know you're opposed to that idea, but I do think we need, you know, and that's why I think we need to go back to the basics of our common humanity, citizenship, irrespective of our background and beliefs. And also, I mean, I know everyone's going to hate me now, but I'm for open borders, I'm against Muslim profiling. And I do think that, you know, Europe has your open borders, for example. That doesn't mean there are no checks, but the free movement of people, I think, is a really basic human right. And I think, you know, it's unfortunate that all these people who are fleeing, and some of us have been in that situation, you know, fleeing for our lives, leaving everything behind, you know, never being able to go back home, losing, you know, my grandmother died, never being able to go to her funeral, my uncles. It's a very traumatic thing to start from the beginning and be treated like dirt because you happen to be born somewhere else. So I think, you know, empathy for people who are fleeing is really important. And also not placing collective blame, you know. It's, everyone is not Breivik in Norway. Am I saying his name right? Breivik. Everyone is not Breivik in Norway. Oh, there's a white man. Oh, you must be exactly like Breivik. You know, it's absurd. But this is how we look at people from Muslim backgrounds. And when I came to this country, well, I didn't come to this country. When I left Iran, I was still a Muslim. You know, my family is still a Muslims, and they don't support Islamism. They hate Sharia law, and a lot of people fleeing have the same idea. You know, one thing Kenan Malik says, he's a British author. He says that, you know, Sharia law is not written in our DNAs. You know, we have feminists and secularists, we have free thinkers, and we have socialists, and I think it's important not to place collective blame. If someone does something wrong, if Breivik kills people and commits that tragedy, hold him accountable. Don't hold everyone in Norway accountable. In the same way, if there's a terrorist that attacks a mosque or a church, don't forget Islamists kill more Muslims than anybody else across the world. Don't hold all Muslims accountable, hold those terrorists accountable. And I think you know, moving away from collective blame is really important. And as I said, ex-Muslims are also not a homogenous group. You know, I have a lot of ex-Muslims I don't agree with, who hate me. You know, I saw something about how they want to divorce me. I'm not married to them, they don't need to worry about divorcing me. Well, nobody's forcing you to agree with me. You know, we have our opinions, we're fighting for our opinions. I'm going to fight to bring as many ex-Muslims as I can to this side, to the side where we see the humanity of Muslims, because otherwise we're going to lose. If you're going to say about Muslims the same things they say about you, well, we're back to square one. You know, so it is a fight, and I think in the same way that you don't agree with everyone who's Norwegian, we don't agree with everyone who's ex-Muslim. And I think part of just that shift, don't see us as a group, is really important in being able to find your allies, you know, because that's what we're missing now. We can't see who our friends are, because if you look a certain way, well, you're them, you're the enemy. And if you look like me, even though you're a fascist, burning down asylum centers, then you're on my side. No. It's about politics, not identity.
I don't have much to add to that, but I will say that I agree with what Maryam said specifically. Why are they your enemies? I mean, I'm a proselytizer by nature. By that I mean I'm an activist, right? I believe in certain things, and I want everybody else to agree with me. That's what I want. That's what I want. That's why I speak. That's why I share, because I want to win over converts to my causes, and my causes happen to be secularism and freedom of speech and conscience for everyone. So I think of, when I look at a Muslim, I think of somebody who is a potential future ex-Muslim. That's how I'm approaching, because, well, you don't know. You don't know. And what you mentioned, Maryam, that when you came to Britain, right, or that you were a Muslim. So I was a Muslim too. I was very young, but I was a Muslim at that time. I was when I grew up in the United States. That's when I changed. I wasn't who I was right at the border. I became this way. I was influenced by the arguments around me that were very moving. I was influenced by feminist thought, particularly, very much so when I was young, and it continued to influence me, and it led me, away from religion, because I saw that as a source of misogyny. And when it is not racist, to be clear, it's not racist to acknowledge that we might see certain problems within Muslim communities, or there might be certain practices that are more common in Islam due to scripture or history or what have you. That's not racist. What's racist is saying that it will necessarily stay that way, that Muslims cannot respond to rational inquiry, to persuasion, to the same things that Europeans responded to, because Europeans weren't always so open and welcoming and tolerant. Once upon a time, that wasn't the case in Europe. And why wouldn't it be the case that we will see the same in Muslim communities and in the Muslim world, for lack of a better term? The Muslim world. That's what
Okay, I have 3 hands who have been in the air. The first one, okay, 4 over there. We have 5 minutes until we should be finished. I suppose we can stretch it for a couple of minutes extra. But I'll ask for brevity both in the questions and in the answers from here on out.
We're the problem. I won't speak.
My name is Mats Liland. Amongst other things, I work at the Stormlederbyen for Født Fri. And I'm leader of Stop Omskjæring, Stop Circumcision. So my question is do you see a growing movement of Muslims against circumcision of boys? And is the right course to reinterpret texture, scripture, or just say that, okay, human rights supersedes religion, that's it?
Well, I can't speak to the circumcision debate specifically. I don't know if you can, Maryam. But I will say that I land hard on one side of that debate that you brought up, of whether there is a way. That's for the religious to decide. They can parse it however they want. I refuse to start where they want me to start, because no matter what, you start where you already are, where scriptures are, and then you try and pull from that extreme over to where you want to be. I refuse to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to start with humanist secular principles. I'm going to start with that foundation, and I'm going to make my case there. So but I don't know about the specifics.
I think obviously it's great if someone is a believer and wants to use their beliefs to justify human rights. But the problem is, because it's an interpretation just means that it's one of many interpretations. And so when you start discussing human rights within a framework of interpretations, it can become problematic, because you interpret it a certain way. There are tens of thousands of others that would interpret it as pro-male circumcision, and FGM for that matter. So I think that's why I think this insistence on secularism is really important. The fact that we have to insist that, look, whatever our beliefs, I'm an atheist, but I don't want an atheist state. I don't want what's happening in China, where Muslims are in the millions being put in concentration camps. Oh, great, it's an atheist state. No. And I think that's the thing. So it's not about just our personal beliefs. It's about what's right for children, child's bodily integrity, child welfare. It's a form of torture, really, but religion gives it the right to take place. And it happens a lot in the United States also. I'm really, not just amongst Muslim and Jewish people, but in the US it seems it's like a normal practice. I think that's why we sort of have to move away from the scriptural argument, because it'll put us in a hole. Mm-hmm.
Shabana started with talking about these third generation kids in Norway who are quite, maybe not Shabana's view, I don't remember who said it, but this is I live very close to where this school play took place, in a part of Oslo where there's a lot of different cultures living together, which is great. But the problem I see around me is, like Shabana said, that I feel that a lot of third generation kids are very religious, maybe more religious than their families, right? And how do we deal with that? I know there's a reaction to politicians in Norway becoming more Christians and showing their belief system as well. But I think if we're trying to create a more secular society, how do we communicate with these children who are quite trapped in their struggles? And maybe something from the US and the UK. Do you have any histories and many maybe some positive ways of coming out of these struggles?
I mean, I think, the fact that third generation young people, a lot more are moving towards religion is not completely factual, in the sense that I'm just doing a resilience class on parenting. And, I've learned that when I tell my son, like, you never do your homework, it's not really true, is it? Because he does do his homework sometimes. So this moving away from these sort of absolute statements, I think, will help us. And I have a problem with that myself. So I'm just basically giving you advice that I don't take myself, so don't really listen to me. But so the thing is that even adults and young people organize in a million different ways, against homelessness, the environment, but we only see those that are organized within a religious right framework. And I think that's important to sort of look at it in a more open way. But also, what it shows very clearly, it eliminates the argument for cultural relativism. Because these are kids who are born here. Look what the hell you've done with them. Not you, but you know what I mean. Because, for example, I come from a very secular family in Iran. My grandfather was an Islamic scholar, blah, blah, blah. And, my dad prayed 5 times a day. He's never eaten pork. He's never drank. But our family was secular, so that some of us fasted, some didn't, some wore the hijab, some didn't. No problem. But my young cousin who came to Canada at the age of 3, he took a picture of bin Laden to school. So whose fault is that? It's not our family's fault, I'm sorry to say. But I think, the idea of when you segregate people, when you ghettoize them, when you divide them, this is your culture, this is your religion. Everybody else has to respect it, and this is who you are. You force people into a corner, and don't give them the options to think differently. So I think that's one aspect of it. The other is that, look, this is a phenomenon that's happening everywhere. It's happening, look at pictures of Iran or Afghanistan 40 years ago. It's different than today. Pakistan, a lot of the countries that have Sharia law today didn't have them 40 years ago. So, the fact of the rise of the Islamist movement in contemporary history, partly as a result of US foreign policy during the Cold War, creating a green belt around the Soviet Union. That rise of Islamism has changed all of our lives, our families' lives, our communities' lives, our so-called neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. And I think recognizing that it's changed, and in 40 years it could be something completely different. And I think that's where we need to be focusing on.
I just feel like I'm speaking and I'm just repeating what Maryam was saying in just a slightly different way. But let me do that again. Which is, that I think that there's a common conception of viewing kids from a second and third generation immigrant background as people trapped between two worlds. But I think the better conception is that they actually are trapped without access to either world, complete access. And what do I mean by this? I'm a Pakistani American. I'm not Pakistani. If I go to Pakistan, they hear my American accent. I'm the American there. But here, or in America, I'm Pakistani. So I'm somebody who doesn't really belong well to either culture. And the second I step in one, I'm actually part of the other. Mm-hmm. So when you have second and third generation kids who are growing up in this context, and they're being forced into this position by both sides, as Maryam mentioned, which is the internal pressure to remain Pakistani or Muslim or what have you, and to remain close to your traditions and not go to sleepovers and not date or do anything that a normal American teenager or young person might do. You have those factors, and then you also have racists on the other side who are telling you to stay in your lane, that you don't belong to this broader mainstream narrative. And in that context comes Islam, this universalist religion that is telling you that, well, you're not part of this culture, you're not part of that culture, but this religion will give you a sense of identity. And that sense of identity, that you belong to this universalist grand history that is, classless, and it doesn't have a race, and it doesn't have a gender, and you can really own it, and it can be yours. And so we shouldn't be surprised that young people especially, are so enamored with this identity when they are.
But, I'm sorry, can I just say one other thing to just...
It's a very short thing.
Very short. Got it?
And then I want to say something.
I think also, moving away from this second and third gender, when the hell are they going to be Norwegians? When the hell are we going to be British? When the hell are we going to be French? We're always, this generation, that generation of immigrants. And I think that language itself, we all use it. It sort of does create the environment where, they're different. And if you keep telling someone they're different, look, even just Brexit has made me really, I'm pissed off. They don't want me here, I'm leaving. It does put you in that corner. And even though, you think rationally that there are lots of people who are against Brexit, blah, 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 it does push you in a corner, And so I think, let's just say they're our kids, in the same way some of our kids become white nationalists, some of them become Islamists. How do we prevent our kids from not being extremists? I think Dia Khan does that beautifully, and she's one of yours, isn't she? Or is she a second generation? But, she does that beautifully. I don't know how the hell she does it. She's just amazing.
When is the time to open and read from the Quran together over the sea and so on? Open and read from the Quran and criticize it. One question each month. Yes.
We don't understand.
Like criticizing the Quran as opposed to what we're talking about, I guess. I mean, look, I know there are lots of people who are critical of the Quran. I think, the Quran, the Bible, the Torah, they belong to the Middle Ages. They could be interesting fairy tales, possibly. The problem is, it's getting us killed. But, for me, I think the fight is a political one. And that's why I'm one of those annoying ex-Muslims that don't really focus on the Quran very, very much so. Because I do think, if you have a fight, an enlightenment against Islamism, it will allow you to criticize the Quran without being threatened, or ignore it completely because it has no effect on your life. So I think the fight primarily is a political fight against the religious right. And then you want to read the Quran, do it. I don't want to go anywhere near the Quran or the Bible or the Torah. So if you just leave me alone, I'll be happy to shut up.
My name is Faisal. But you touched upon earlier this dilemma of, as I understand, the liberals are primarily not supporting critique of theology. It's not against the people, it's a theology, and we should be allowed to critique a theology. How do you think, how far have you come in that area, and how do you think the future strategy should be to get the liberal on the side of critique of theology, not people following the theology?
We've been talking about this a lot, about what to do with the liberal problem. My first speech that anyone listened to or paid attention to was called The Necessity of Liberal Critique, because I found when I just started my activism, I encountered that resistance from my people, from the progressive left, and I felt that sense of betrayal, and I wanted to, pull them to my side, and I still do. So I still try, and I still try to speak sense to them. I don't think that what's lacking here is education necessarily. By that I mean, I think everybody understands, or at least everybody on the secular left understands the problems within the religion. It's about the many different reasons why they won't address it. So there's political reasons why they might not want to address it. There's social pressures for them. That's why they don't want to address it. So I think that we have to address them. Those different issues that are preventing them from tackling this issue. But at the same time, I've started to come around to the belief, and we've talked about this privately, that I'm not going to just spend all my time saying, please pay attention to me. Please listen, please stand for us. I'm tired of begging for approval and for scraps from somebody who's not willing to give it to me, right? I mean, this is humanism, atheism, criticism of religion. I'm not borrowing this tradition from someone else. It belongs to me as much as it belongs to anyone. So I'm just going to lead, and with the hopes that the progressive left and liberals follow.
To that, I mean, I'm very firmly on the left myself. I'm a commie, and I think that actually, better red than dead, or always that's me. Better dead than red. Yeah. So I mean, I do think that the fight against religion, anti-clericalism, is a fight of the left historically, and I think either bloody do your job or just stop calling yourself left, because you're embarrassing the rest of us. So I do think that, and frankly, I mean, I think that a lot of the fights that you see in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Iran, these are left, this is the left of that society fighting for human rights and human welfare. And I think that's why sometimes it worries me, this focus on the left, because it gives the far right and the right a free rein. We're always talking about how the left, and I do that as well, the left's let us down. It is a politics of betrayal. I've said that myself. In my talk, I talked about how they've betrayed us. But the Tory government has very close relations with the Saudi regime. It's allowing, we're fighting so long against Sharia courts in that country. The British government has sided with the fundamentalists against minority women who are fighting for equal rights. So my concern is sometimes this focus doesn't let us see that this is something that many people in the left are fighting for across the globe. And if you're not fighting it, then you're not really left. I'm sorry to break it to you.
Then we're finished. Dagfinn, we have a couple of presents. Dagfinn and I are going to be sort of local Santa Clauses.
Oh, wow.
Oh, can we open them? We open them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is not so easy to do.
This one is a little hard.
I think this calls for a final applause.
A hijab and a book on Dharma. It's a very conflicting message.